Good afternoon. My name is Bashir Fancy. I am one of the founders at BIZTEK Professional Association of Canada, BTPAC. We're part of ICCP, or the Institute for Certification of Computer Professionals, which is based out of Chicago. We, BTPAC, BIZTEK is Canada. And we are very pleased as we have been bringing you different speakers as part of the series we keep doing to bring you more knowledge, both technology and business. As you know, we are all about certification, ethics, code of ethics, um, continuous education. We have body of knowledge training. I won't go into it here. Just give you a quick update there. And by the way, one of the three things that we've said, you can join BTPAC, or BizTech Professional Association of Canada, by sending us your details at join@btpac.org. You can register for webinars, events at btpac.org. And if you have any questions, information as to about our programs, we'll be very happy to answer them for you. But also, you can get involved in volunteering if you want to contribute in any other way as a speaker, whatever, because this is your organization. That said, let me move on quickly to the fact that today we have Jeff Moll. He's well known in the industry in the fact that he thinks outside the box. Has done a lot of work on the model of regional economic community, and we'll talk about it since post COVID-19 crisis, the world will be very different. We're talking about how does business support itself, fund itself. That's both business and technology in the post COVID-19 situation. We know that there's no unlimited funds. In fact, most of the countries don't have. They're all going into debt to do this. How are you going to recover and recoup this fund? So I'm going to be asking him some questions, and he's done a pretty decent job of thinking outside the box and discussing those models. Now, the last part before I bring Jeff on is I want to take once again a special thanks to Samba Live. They've been our partners and sponsors, and we truly thank them. You probably know about Zoom and other kind of webinar type software. You don't know about Samba Live. They're pretty good. And today we're using Samba, and they are our partners. So thank you, Samba. And now I bring Jeff Moll, who will obviously talk about Community Enterprises Network. And if you have any questions after you heard the presentation, it'll be our pleasure to answer. You can send us email. So is Jeff's email. So without much further ado, let me bring in Jeff now. I want to introduce to you our guest today, Jeff Moll. And rather than me introduce him, because he's a very person with a pretty good background, and you will hear it as you go through. You'll find out that he's thought through this in a quite a detailed manner, so to speak.
Thank you, Bashir.
And so you can. Well, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself, and then I can start asking you my questions, right?
Yeah. So my name is Jeff Moll, and I organize an organization called Community Enterprise Network. It started off as Trillium Energy Alliance many years ago with a view to developing renewable energy projects for the benefit of communities. But over time, we saw a need for the model to develop in other areas, particularly as it relates to public sector procurement, extraction of our natural resources, opportunities that are regulated opportunities, or in other words, government issued licenses. So we developed this model, and well, would have loved to maybe pass the job off to someone else, but there was really no one else doing it. So I felt that it was quite innovative approach to creating jobs and economic activity, but with the better outcomes for communities.
That's fantastic. So then I will dive into it straight away. Given we are now in a new environment where the world is changing drastically past COVID-19. So what I want to start with a comment that I heard the other day, which we have heard quite a bit from different people. But Guy Kawasaki, who's a venture capitalist and a marketing specialist out of Silicon Valley, is also author of absolutely 11 books, is the best of my knowledge, which are bestsellers. He Stanford graduate. Actually, what he said the other day, which you are hearing from all the experts around the world, that what we are now going to move forward to is the new normal, and that we're not going back. He said that, and he was talking about the business, the way we do things, the economy, and not only that, he was he passed a comment that if anybody came and told you that they knew where it was going, don't listen to them, which was interesting, because it's not that's not what's going to happen. So, given that situation, um, how do you think? We're not going back, uh,
Right.
and you agree with that. How do we move forward differently than what we've done in the past?
Well, as you know, we live in a capitalist society, which means private enterprise produces goods and services. Most people would think the alternative to that is socialism, where public enterprises produce goods and services. I think there's room to grow the community economy or the community economic sector, where community enterprises produce goods and services. So basically, a community enterprise is controlled by, it's a governance structure for controlling a corporation that makes money, and with a view to reinvesting the profits for the betterment of the community. So there are plenty of examples, but we can get to that later. Essentially, what needs to happen is, if there's a business opportunity, generally in the community enterprise sector, the best opportunities are either taxpayer funded, or involve resource extraction, or opportunities that are regulated, such as, say, a federally regulated opportunity might be the mobile communications sector, or the production of marijuana, or opportunities that are on federal land that require a license of occupation. And then there's opportunities that are in that are just in the public interest, where either the private sector is not developing those opportunities, and communities want to develop opportunities with a view to creating jobs and economic activity. And those opportunities may or may not be attractive enough for the private sector, but ultimately it's a way of communities controlling their destination when it comes to creating new jobs. And so those are some of the best opportunities for local communities to develop. So there are basically provincial opportunities, federal opportunities, and local opportunities. And so when we refer to the community, we would either be referring to the community of Canada if it's a federal opportunity. So in other words, this is something that benefits all of Canadians. Or it could be, if it's a provincial opportunity, it would be the community of, say, Ontario or Quebec. If the opportunity is financed by the taxpayers of Ontario, then the benefits should flow to the people of Ontario. And same with natural resources. If it's a provincial resource, then we could use those resources to benefit the people of Ontario. So going back to what you're saying about COVID-19 and the health crisis that we face, the governments are spending an awful lot of money to stimulate the economy and protect the health of Ontarians, Canadians. At the end of the day, we are spending a lot of money. We need to, the public purse is rapidly being drained, and ultimately we need to find a way to refill that purse. And so we need to start to protect some of those procurement opportunities that are funded by the taxpayer. We need to protect our natural resources that sometimes, when we allow the private sector in, those opportunities end up benefiting people that aren't domiciled in Canada. And so we need to find a way to ensure that the profits that are derived from natural resource extraction can flow back into for the betterment of Canadians. So the situation is that currently we only really know the two models. Either it would be a public enterprise that would develop such opportunities, or it would be the private sector, and more often than not, it's private enterprise that produces those types of opportunities. And I would argue that we need to put in place policies and programs to enable the community enterprise sector to grow and thrive in Canada. And those, I can get into those policies and programs that are necessary a little bit later, but I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, it does. You've given a pretty good background of what it would mean. Now, because of what you're talking about, do you want to explain some of the model? Because there's obviously a capitalist model and all the different type of thing that would play into this, right?
Sure. So community enterprise, the governance structure and the operation of the business is very much like a private enterprise. The difference being that there are no shareholders, and therefore by law, the surplus revenues would be donated for the betterment of the community. And so in the case of, let's say, a mobile communications company, the corporation needs to have access to capital, but it also needs to have access to the opportunity. So what is proposed is that it's actually a cooperative corporation structure. So a co-op is formed in one of two ways. Either it's a co-op with share capital or a co-op without share capital. And I advocate for the co-op without share capital model, particularly because there's so much capital needed that raising that kind of money through share offerings is not the right way to go. And ultimately, the shareholders expect to get a return on investment, and therefore that doesn't necessarily end up benefiting the community. So essentially, it's a corporation. What has to happen is you need a founding board of directors to start the corporation. Then you need members who would then elect a board of directors. The board of directors is responsible for hiring the CEO or the president. So the president is responsible for hiring the wage and salaried employees and running the business as you would any other private enterprise. The difference comes in with that rather than having shareholders, there are members. So the members are responsible for electing the board of directors. So this basically gives the community members control over the corporation. And the membership is open to any member of the community for a nominal fee. And that gives them, as I said, the right to vote for the board of directors and the right to vote on the financial affairs of the corporation, to raise a motion at an annual general meeting, and to sit on a committee. So when the corporation starts earning revenue, obviously revenue would first and foremost go to operating and maintaining the business and servicing any debt. Further revenues would be set aside on reserve for unforeseen circumstances or to build the business further. Anything over and above that is considered a surplus, and by law in Ontario, that surplus must be used to further the mission of the organization, to further cooperative principles, or would be donated for the betterment of the community. And so in the case where you're donating surplus revenues to the community, a request for proposal is then put out to community organizations who are looking to run projects that are for the benefit of the community. This gives the community organizations a source of revenue for those programs that the taxpayer might otherwise pay for, but ultimately they're there to build a more sustainable community. And so that's essentially how the governance structure works. The problem really comes into the financing structure, and this is where we need policies and programs by the government. So A policy might be the government is prepared to consider the model before outsourcing opportunities to the private sector. And a program would be that they would put in place access to startup capital. So startup capital can come incrementally. It can start off with basically business planning, mobilizing a founding board of directors, incorporating the business, putting together a business plan, putting together, feasibility studies, pre-feasibility studies. So incrementally, you don't need an awful lot to start. But as the enterprise starts to make sense and it looks like there's a feasible opportunity to create jobs and grow a business that will operate in the black, then further startup capital could be provided. So there would be milestones in there. But ultimately, once the business is at the point where it's shovel ready, it maybe needs to build a facility or acquire capital assets, then the corporation is going to need access to long-term capital. And that capital could come in the form of bonds issued to private individuals and anyone that wants to invest in the corporation by way of providing debt. The corporation could also go out and enter into an agreement with a lender to borrow money. So ultimately, the corporation needs to have access to long-term capital. And in order to attract capital at the lowest possible interest rate, I would argue that it's in the best interest of the people of Canada to backstop that. So, or in other words, provide a loan guarantee so that the corporation can borrow money at the lowest possible interest rate, but ultimately with a view to paying it back and operating the business in the black, and that corporation will then use all of its profits for the betterment of the community. So I hope that kind of covers the structure a little bit.
Right. A couple of small things in terms of the funding that they could issue bond, which is not a bad thing. Would the government kind of back the bond like they did for the solar and things like that, so that funding becomes a little easier to get, kind of thing?
Yes, yeah, that's the whole point. Because there's going to be large amounts of capital needed. We're talking about really quite large enterprises that are, might require $200 million, $500 million in capital to build out. But ultimately, out of that, you're creating, 200, 300, 400, 500 jobs, and so that is in the interest. So that helps to build a more sustainable economy within the community, and depending on the opportunity, there is a great opportunity to protect those surplus revenues from leaving Canada in the case where the undertaking might be taken up by a multinational corporation.
So, do you have an example of an organization where this concept has been used already?
So a similar model would be the Greater Toronto Airport Authority, or the airport authorities across Canada, really. When the federal government, Transport Canada, used to operate the airports, the government wanted to get out of that business, and they could have privatized it, in which case the airports might have been the opportunity to operate the airports may have been acquired by a company from Germany or the UK or the United States, in which case the profits from running the airport would have left Canada and enriched others that aren't domiciled here. But instead, what the government did is they caused a not-for-profit corporation to be created. The Greater Toronto Airport Authority, for example, brings in approximately, last time I looked, about $1.1 billion a year in gross revenue. And from what I understand, they've been voted the best large airport in North America 3 years in a row. So there is a case to be made that a not-for-profit corporation can run a good business. successful business. There are people that will take issue with that, that the landing fees are high or that the CEO is paid too much money. But one has to ask oneself, if it were privatized, would it be any different? Would the CEO be making any less money? Would the landing fees be any lower? Would all the other fees be lower? And the question is, would it be as well run an organization? Because there's a tendency that if it's privatized, to cut corners in order to increase shareholder value. So perhaps it's such a well-run enterprise because it's a not-for-profit corporation. There's much more research needs to be done on that particular thesis, but I would, any viewers that are watching this that might have knowledge of how the structure of the Greater Toronto Airport works, I'd love to hear from them. But basically, that's my understanding, and that's a great example.
Is there any legislation that was created? Was there a legislation created, or does one exist? How do you go about making that happen?
So, well, I'm asking that the governments of the federal government and the provincial governments pass what I would refer to as a Community Economy Act. So that act will put in place the policies and programs needed to incorporate these types of business, to ensure the success of the community enterprise sector. So, those policies goes back to the government protecting procurement opportunities by offering them giving communities the right of first refusal to develop those business opportunities before they go to the private sector. Or it might be in the case of, let's say, for example, on the Trent Severn Waterway, there are opportunities to develop hydroelectric generating projects. The government could say, we're going to give communities the right of first refusal to build those hydroelectric generating stations before we go and offer them to the private sector. But so those types of policies would be contained within the Community Economy Act. But the Act would also put in place a program to enable those community enterprises from across the country to access startup capital. There are lots of programs out there that offer small bits and pieces of money, but it's not a sustainable. For these organizations to have to go out and seek a grant every time they want to do a little project, it's not an efficient way of running a business. The business needs to know that there's a reliable source of startup capital, but that capital will be invested smartly and will have a reasonable prospect of providing a return on investment for the taxpayers of Canada. And also the access to long-term capital. So there will be a program to access long-term capital. And whether, perhaps it could be as much as $1 trillion community economy bond that is backed by the federal government would then enable these corporations to efficiently reach out and obtain capital for many, many large undertakings that are going to create thousands of jobs across Canada. And ultimately, these corporations then have access to capital at the lowest possible interest rate. There are some other things that I would suggest putting in there. And because we are in an economic and health emergency right now, we need to look at how do we protect our natural resources from being acquired by multinational corporations. Canada is rich in natural resources. We need to ensure that those resources benefit Canadians. And we've done a very poor job of that over the years. You'll find that there are many multinationals that own businesses that have the rights to extract our natural resources. So I think there's a room to put in some emergency measures in there to either repatriate some of those natural resources, or at the very least, ensure that community enterprises have the access to extract those natural resources before they go out to the private sector.
Yeah, this is a very interesting area you touched. The reason I am saying is this: that I recall Pierre Elliott Trudeau had put in a national, I think it was National Energy Program, wherever the intent was that the natural resources would be protected in Canada for Canadians. Um, I think Petro Canada and all came out of that, which then changed later on. And now we have a situation exactly as you are describing, where we don't necessarily control our vital resources. That may actually include water
Yeah,
too, right? Water would
yeah.
go into that too, as would be lumber. What are your views there?
Well, I think if I'm not mistaken, the Chinese National Oil Company, which is a state-owned enterprise out of China, owns a big chunk of our oil reserves in Alberta through the acquisition of a company that had the rights and decided that they were going to sell to the Chinese National Oil Company. You know, this is a little bit off topic, but I can tell you the government, because of our health and economic emergency, has recently indicated that they're going to use $1.7 billion of taxpayer money
Right.
to rehabilitate orphan wells that's orphaned wells, not Orson Welles. The orphaned wells that are exhausted by the private sector, but they abandoned the infrastructure and left a mess behind. So the taxpayer is now on the hook for cleaning up that, because the private sector has closed up shop. The shareholders received their dividends long ago, and they walked away from a mess. I believe that an expert in the field in Alberta indicated that the total cost for cleaning up all of the orphaned wells in Alberta, or at least in Western Canada, is somewhere in the order of $260 billion.
Correct.
So, is the taxpayer going to be on the hook for that? Well, perhaps the taxpayer needs to find a way to recoup those costs, or claw back those dividends from those shareholders that took too much and didn't ensure that they were able to clean up their mess when the well was exhausted. So as it stands right now, this $1.7 billion, that's a bit of a drop in the bucket, but it's a good start, is going to create jobs in Western Canada to clean up wells. I would argue that there's a strong case to be made to develop that business as a community enterprise. The alternative is, we're out of that 1.7 billion. If it's a private undertaking, if we hire private companies to do it, how much profit are those private companies going to take out of that 1.7 billion dollars? Presumably, it's going to be in the hundreds of millions anyway. And with the public purse being as depleted as it is in response to the health crisis, perhaps there's a better way of developing that enterprise of cleaning up orphaned wells in Western Canada. Did that answer your question?
Yes. In fact, slightly off the top, but it's relevant in that Alberta, many years ago, that said they would never get trapped like this, that they would have developed agriculture and many other things. If you look at what you just said, this is not sustainable, because if the oil prices don't go because people start working from home, they will need to change. And yet the people who benefited, that got the returns, they walked away in Canada, and everybody else is stuck with a $260 billion bill. And like you said, 1.7 is a good start, as long as it is not necessarily given to the corporate world. If I'm just recapping what you just said, it's given to a not-for-profit type organization, which has this rules in place about how they would spend the money. They create jobs so that the money is not going to the shareholders, because that's exactly what will happen if they're not careful. We see that in
Yeah.
US right now with the money that's been given out.
Yeah.
It's gone to the two top percent and the money's already been wiped out. Can't have that. Because this type of thing also leaves open for fraud too, right?
Yeah. Now, the other thing I would say with regards to oil is that we're spending an awful lot of time and trouble to build a pipeline to ship the oil to China. And so the raw materials are going to be upgraded in China. Why aren't we upgrading our raw materials here and using our natural resources here? Well, partly because there's no private sector proponent who stepped up and built the necessary facilities to upgrade that material here. So I think there's a case to be made that perhaps in Thunder Bay or Sault Ste. Marie, there's a large pool of talented work. There's a large talented workforce there, and that type of undertaking would be quite suited to development in that area, and that would allow Canadians to use Canadian oil. So there really needs to be a proponent that's prepared to step up and do that. And at this time when we're looking to create jobs and economic activity in Canada, that might be a starter for a community enterprise in Northern Ontario.
So that's a very interesting concept, what you're talking about. Then, although we're talking about oil, but as one of the examples, would this not apply to, like, we had the 3M situation with the N95 masks? We're exporting lumber and then buying the thing back, when we could create jobs by having factories about doing those. A lot of the raw materials goes out of Canada, and that would be true of even oil. We give away oil and buy a refined product when we could actually, right?
Yeah. So the N95 mask is a very interesting situation. So I think, from what I understand, pulp comes from Western Canada because it's a specific species of tree that produces the pulp that 3M uses in their N95 masks. When we had this as a big concern, where it appeared that Donald Trump was going to block the export of these masks to Canada, I did reach out to through LinkedIn to some people at 3M with the prospect of using their technology and their expertise to create a new business here in Canada, because it didn't seem it made sense to 3M even to stop sending those here. So I felt that it might be in Canadians' interest to develop a manufacturing facility here using, again, startup capital and long-term capital backed by the taxpayer, but ultimately with a view to providing benefits to Canadians.
So we use the 2-3 examples you just talked about. It creates jobs. One of the interesting thing, and Guy Kawasaki talked about it the other day, that every organization needs to revisit the supply chain, which means you better have your supply chain where you are. Now, people have different opinion, but it would be interesting to know, if we go by whatever we are saying, is your view that or what do you think about the fact that the globalization, global trade, in relation to exactly what we just talked about, the supply chain, how do you see that evolving, or what do you think will happen?
Well, I think the good news is that Canada is rich in natural resources, so that we are a wealthier country than some of the other countries that don't do as good a job at protecting our natural resources. We do need to diversify our supply chain, obviously. The only model we seem to know is the capitalist model as to how to diversify our supply chain. So if diversification of our supply chain is in the public interest, then I think there's a case to be made that we should invest in developing those enterprises and ensuring they continue to operate here. And you can't do that with private enterprise, because they, in a globalized world, they have the freedom of mobility to move manufacturing to wherever is best suited to reduce their production costs, which ultimately that ends up shipping jobs to low-wage jurisdictions. So certainly there is a role for private enterprise to play, and I'm certainly not anti-capitalist. I just think that there is room for other models other than just the capitalist model
to coexist.
So certainly, yes. I think
yeah.
I think we need to start with and look for those opportunities that make the most sense. So if you want to talk about some other opportunities, we can go there if you like.
Sure. Why not? Because I'll tell you why I'm asking this. Is that given the fact that we know that U.S. has clearly, in fact, there's a talk coming from the Treasury Secretary that they're willing to even pick up the costs of moving the companies back from China to the United States. And there's been seriously talked about, and they're pushing very hard on that. I don't see that happening in Canada. We haven't talked about it because, like everybody else, we're dealing with the COVID-19 situation. But we need the government now to think out of the box. Even the businesses to think out of the box, right? What do you think? Yeah.
Well, I'm not sure I quite see where you're going with that, but take for example, I know in the case of the U.S. is a huge marketplace. The Canadian marketplace does not have quite the buying power there, but we do have the production power because of our wealth in natural resources and our wealth in human resources. We have really talented workforce, and so most of the corporations that are operating in China are not Canadian corporations. So we don't really have that leverage, but we can start our own businesses in those spaces, and we can, and maybe in the case of like N95 masks or other specialized technology, we can get a license to produce such goods and services from the folks that have innovated, that have been innovative in various technological spaces. But the fact is, there has to be a business case for developing any such enterprise here, and that's where the startup capital to put together a business case and a business plan and prove the opportunity is going to help make our supply chain more resilient. All that has to happen before we get too far along the road.
I think you did answer what I was asking, which is that if you look at China and they become a global power, that they don't export raw material, they export finished goods.
That's right. They import raw materials.
They import raw materials. Canada actually exports raw materials and then buys the other part, which puts us into a bind many times, like the situation we just talked about. But also the jobs are created somewhere else, right?
Right. So that's where, particularly in the mining and the pulp and the forestry sector, and even technology to a certain degree. The fact that we have these natural resources, we are in Ontario at least putting some conditions on some new projects that the materials must be refined here and processed here, thereby creating processing jobs. But let's take nickel for example. Nickel's a key component of batteries that go into electric cars. But so we'll refine the nickel here. But are we building the batteries here? And if we need to do, and if the private sector is not doing the job of building the batteries here using our raw materials, then maybe we need to find another way of developing that business. And again, there has to be a business case for it, but I believe there are business cases, especially since we govern the raw materials.
And I think you hit the nail on the head there, because if I look at the technology side, where you touched briefly, and it's supposed to be both business technology, is that, for example, we say you cannot send personally identifiable information or personal data to outside Canada to US as well.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Yet, although the company said, no, we are processing here, but their database is not here. It's in the United States,
Yeah.
which means technically, if the government wanted to get to at a Canadian data, we know that's happened in the past. They can use Patriot Act and many other things to go after and saying we want to examine. They couldn't do it for competitive reasons, right?
Yeah,
So,
so that's not really my
right,
area of expertise, but certainly that's a problem. And maybe one of your viewers might have a solution as to how we can incorporate the need to protect our data and still create jobs and economic activity here.
I can tell you that I dealt with it heavily, but I think the challenge, and to some extent, you see Amazon, right, is actually and Google and all that, they're trying to set up shop here. But I just wanted to, it's a similar type example. So that's actually um, very good in terms of what we're talking about.
Yeah.
The
If I just look at some of in the technology space, the opportunity that I see is probably the best opportunity right now is in the mobile communication space.
Okay, go
Okay,
ahead.
so Canadians pay about the highest mobile communication rates in the developed world. Successive governments have stated they want to increase competition in the mobile communication space. So could you imagine if your mobile communication provider used all of its profits to reduce the cost or improve the service, or with any luck, has some surplus left over to reinvest in building stronger communities? I think ultimately there is a good case because the mobile spectrum, the public resource that is necessary to run a mobile communication company is under the control of the federal government. The federal government could say, we are going to stop allowing the private sector to take the bandwidth that is required to run a mobile communication company and allocate it to a community enterprise so that we can build up that competition within the mobile communication space and create a business that's operating in the interest of the users. The users would be entitled to be members of the co-op. The users would be entitled to vote on the financial affairs of the corporation, to elect the board of directors, so that they would have complete control over the corporation through a democratic process. And ultimately, at the end of the day, it's going to provide better outcomes and likely cause those private mobile communication companies to reduce their costs.
So that is actually very interesting about mobile, since we have the most expensive kind of rates in the world almost. But given what we're talking about, the Community Economic Act, the model which would create jobs here, we have more control over our natural resources, again, creating job, and you're not at the mercy of anybody else. My question would be, given that one of the examples of things I'm thinking about is 407, are you able to speak on that? Where do you see that? How would that have fit in here?
So I was asked about the 407 quite often through the development of this process. People in Ontario largely consider the 407 to be a ripoff of the Ontario government. The taxpayers paid to build this toll highway. The numbers are all over the map, but if you factor in the cost of the value of the land and the construction costs, you could be upwards of $100 billion to develop that toll highway. The governments, when they were developing it, indicated that it would be a toll highway only up until it was paid for, and then the tolls would be lifted, and it would be just like any other highway. But instead, after it was built, for ideological reasons, the government decided that they would privatize it. You see, the conservatives want smaller government, lower taxes, and less regulation, generally speaking. Socialists want larger government enterprise and are prepared to spend taxes to do that. The model that I'm talking about would have enabled the government to privatize the 407 like they did. So what they did is they put it out to tender. The bids came in, and the bid was that the bidder would operate the highway for 30 years and would pay the government of Ontario $3 billion to operate it for 30 years. The government said, no. We don't want to go back to the socialist model. Take it for an additional 70 years or 69 years and give us another $100 million. So it went from $3 billion to $3.1 billion we got in return for allowing a private company to operate the 407 for 99 years. In 2019, the 407 earned $1.5 billion in toll fees to operate that highway. With a net income of $575 million profit. Now the thing is that the operator of the highway is a consortium of companies from Spain, Australia, SNC-Lavalin is in there. So most of that revenue leaves Ontario, and it's not coming back. I guess recently SNC-Lavalin sold about 10% of that business for $3.5 billion. So we now know that opportunity is worth something like $35 billion, something that we sold many years ago for $3.1 billion. So we probably didn't get the right price for it, and is just generally perceived as a bad deal for Ontarians. So if you take what I'm talking about with a community enterprise model, what could have happened is a not-for-profit corporation would have been established. And if the programs and policies that are in place that I'm suggesting are necessary, that corporation could have acquired the highway from the taxpayers, the right to operate it anyway, for the $3.1 billion that we received. But instead of having that $575 million a year that leaves Ontario to enrich others from other lands, that $575 million would have been put back into either reducing the cost, improving the highway, reducing the debt for the acquisition of the opportunity, and any surplus would be donated for the betterment of Ontarians. So it would have been a much better outcome than what we have now, which is the operation of the highway for the next 80 years. For another 80 years, it just doesn't make sense. So I've actually submitted a petition to a number of different members of provincial parliament, asking that they use the theory of the doctrine of parliamentary sovereignty to overturn that contract. And if anyone's interested in seeing that petition, it's available through my LinkedIn profile, or just go on LinkedIn and look up Take Back the 407. There's a group there with a copy of the petition and all of the background information that one would need to. So, that's my story on the 407. It just basically, as I was learning about cooperatives and how public or community enterprises operate, it occurred to me that would have been a great opportunity to develop a community enterprise, much like they did with the airport when they had the opportunity to either privatize it or do something different.
This 407 example and the numbers you just gave are pretty stunning. I don't think people know that as to what the revenues are, because it was intended to alleviate traffic on 401 in Toronto. It's the East-West Highway, in case people who are listening are outside of Ontario. It's basically 401 or McDonald Carter, the highway that runs all the way across Canada, right? And
right.
and basically that traffic is not getting alleviated because it's becoming very expensive to go onto 407. So that's
right.
not now. All that's going to change anyway, given that more people start to work from home. But it's still a very important example of, so whether it was incompetence on the part of the government, whoever was involved, I think it was been Mike Harris, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
Was it incompetence or?
I think it was mostly ideology. The fact that the government of the day didn't feel that the government should be running a revenue generating enterprise. The government is that the government should get out of that business, and the only model they knew at the time was privatization. So
where would the government get the money from? Tax? That's it?
Sorry, I don't. The question, no, I guess.
Where would the government, if they don't run something like that to recoup some revenues, where would they get the income from? Just income tax?
So the taxpayers already paid for the construction cost. It was already out there. The contract was intended to reduce our debt, which it did by $3.1 billion. But we could have done the same. The community enterprise sector could have acquired the business for the same $3.1 billion. So the taxpayers' position would be approximately the same. The accountants would probably want to beg to differ with me, because if the debt is still being backed by the taxpayer, there's going to be a longer period where it would still remain on the books. But ultimately, the situation is that company earning $1.5 billion a year, it doesn't take very long to pay off the debt. Now they're still issuing bonds. I think they're even issuing bonds now. But ultimately, the government needs to consider this model, and the 407 is probably the best example of how to apply it.
I would I gotta leave the subject. Well, my comment would be that the Canadian taxpayers or taxpayers are paying twice. Once through the taxes they paid for the building the highway and servicing it, and second when they use it again, and that makes zero sense to me.
Yeah. Now, just on the subject before we leave it, I've spoken with many people who say, well, keep it a toll highway. It's the best investment I ever make on a monthly, because it reduces their time. They can get to the airport or wherever they're going relatively quickly. And that's true. So I'm not suggesting that we have to remove the tolls, although that is one option. I think it's up to the members of the community enterprise to make a decision. If they are able to take the tolls off, would they want to? The other side of that coin is that if it is so expensive to travel on, that means that it becomes a highway for the wealthy, and that the citizens, anyone who has to check their pocketbook before they get onto the 407, that's not right, and that it should be more readily available.
Derek told me the other day that when he was visiting, I think a golf tournament, whatever, a few months ago, from his place here, not quite, I think Dundas, to Bathurst and 407, that it cost him $72. That's Now, if that money had gone back into the coffers of the taxpayers and they could use it for the community work, whatever, is one thing. But the money is going to end up in Spain or whatever else. So that actually is a lot of concern. I'll tell you something very interesting. What you talked about, I'm going to bring technology into it from a different standpoint, and I'll just make a quick comment that a lot of the banks and a lot of the organizations have outsourced technology overseas. It creates two or three different problems besides the money going out there. Initially, we just outsourced the customer service and frontline. Problem
Hmm.
is that when you get to security and a lot of other stuff, and we talk about cloud, and what happens is the skills are also getting built outside Canada, not here.
Well, let's just, I'll touch on that
So,
from the standpoint of going back to the 407. There was a rather complex tolling technology that the taxpayers of Ontario paid to develop. When we issued the license to operate the highway, we also included that technology, and now that company is able to use that technology around the world to make money. I believe a similar thing happened with the Presto card. Now, the Ontario government or Metrolinx or whichever organization was responsible for the Presto card outsourced the development of that system. And I believe it went to Accenture, if I'm not mistaken. Maybe one of the viewers would know more about it than I do, but I believe it went to Accenture.
that's
And
correct.
from what I understand, Accenture then took the province of Ontario did not do a good enough job at protecting our intellectual property, and that allowed the developer of the Presto system to then take that knowledge and use it to sell that technology to other jurisdictions. And I'm led to believe that New York may be a customer of them, and I'm not. So again, if the viewers know any more of that, but that would be an example of how wrong that is. So and it was developing Presto was a large enough undertaking that a community enterprise could have hired the technology talent necessary. It's all really just a matter of recruiting the right people to do a job. And I think ultimately that development of the Presto could have been developed by a community enterprise, and then the community enterprise could have then sold the technology around the world, and the profits would have gone for the betterment of Ontarians.
I was peripherally involved, but very good friend of mine was involved in this project, and he confirmed exactly what he said. In fact, I would say the project was botched up. Not only that, so the costs, in fact, went up. The reason we talk about technology is that the comment I had started, which was that we develop skills outside. So what happens is now we're talking about artificial intelligence, and the government's pouring a lot of money. I'm saying that you can have the outsourcing here in Canada. You can go to areas like some of the very good customer service has been set up in New Brunswick and elsewhere, where your costs are lower, smaller towns. You can actually create that employment. You can bring that thing back into Canada. So you can still outsource because you don't have economies of scale. You're a smaller company. You can still outsource, but you build that technology, that skill sets here, because I speak about this quite a bit. That technology is moving at a pretty rapid pace, as is the innovation, and their skills gaps are getting created because whoever is developing and wherever they're doing it. So you have a challenge. There is a tendency to say because those headcounts are not on your books, right? You
Mm-hmm.
can't say it, but they. I would like organizations to go review the costs that they incur in managing that outsourcing, the oversight when things don't work, and all sorts of problems. And you'll find out that the costs are much higher, and
Yeah.
they're no longer the costs as low as they were when we outsourced 20, 30 years ago. That's number one. Number two, what is also very interesting in there is that their cost, as I said, has gone up. But now the problem here is that you have developed the skills somewhere else. If we're talking about artificial intelligence and making more, um, us using more robotics and all that, we should be doing it here and not building the skills elsewhere. and I think that would pay back because we don't do zero-based budgeting. We take last year's. If you look at corporate
Yeah,
organization, they take last year's number plus or minus 2-3%.
yeah.
That
No,
is
but sure, absolutely. We definitely need to develop skills here. But ultimately, if there's a business opportunity to develop as a community enterprise, and if the enterprise determines that it's in there, that it makes sense to outsource to a low-wage jurisdiction, that's a decision that the board of directors of the enterprise would make. Generally speaking, it's not going to happen, but in theory it could. But that would be up to the board of directors, who are duly elected by the members, and ultimately they're making that decision for business reasons, because it's going to be in the interest of the enterprise as a whole. And when the enterprise does well, the community does well. So
right.
all that is, it's splitting hairs. But ultimately, I think from the technology side, the other thing that we haven't touched on is that we have a lot of large enterprise in the technology space that can say, hey, I want to move to this jurisdiction or that jurisdiction. How much taxpayer money are you prepared to give me if I bring the jobs to Ontario or to Canada? And so the private sector is going out there, private enterprise, large enterprise from the technology space is going out there and shopping the market to find out which jurisdiction is prepared to give them the best taxpayer money. And so, from a standpoint of when it comes to investing in community enterprises from the taxpayer's point of view, we really have to look at where do we get the best return on investment. Investing in large enterprise that already has the money and is just shopping to increase their shareholder values, or is it better to invest in a community enterprise where we control our own destiny? So I think Cisco, for example, did that with the Ontario government. Huawei got some handouts from the Ontario government. So the taxpayers are investing in these private enterprise. Are we getting the commensurate return on investment? Jury's out on that. Maybe your viewers have something to say on that.
Well, we know the General Motors got big money out of the government, and they shut the plant down. So I think there has to be, again, it comes back to the type of agreements you make. And I don't know if politicians do that good a job of that, and that's kind of right. The problem here is that they need to step back because the world post COVID-19, like we have now talked about, is changing drastically. It's not going to go back to the old ways. Any of the projects that people had on the books also, they need to revisit that and look at it and saying people are going to be out of jobs, right? All over the place.
Right.
The concept you're talking about can actually get them back to work, right? And build something. The oil well cleanup that you talked about is a classic example. The 407 type of thing, but there are many other stuff. Telecommunication you talked about. That would actually create jobs here, and they would create jobs in the communities so that people are stuck because they've had to put money out there they didn't have. I don't know that the coffers in Ottawa are that big that they can afford the type of money that's going out, right?
Well, that's it. I guess they're going to have to print money or something. Who knows what they're going to do? But ultimately, I think there's a case to be made that this model makes sense, and I would encourage people to think about it. To read my paper on LinkedIn, I have a paper on LinkedIn called Community Economics 101, where I outline the need for a Community Economy Act that would put in place the policies and programs that are necessary. I could go on. We could go on for hours. Maybe we'll do this again this year. Because I can talk about all sorts of opportunities. I know in the little community where I come from in Muskoka, there's probably something like $500 million worth of capital projects, but ultimately those projects would result in surplus revenues in the order of $10 million. Who knows? There are significant opportunities out there. We just need to identify them and put together a business plan and ensure that these types of enterprises have the sources of available funds. And I think there are, from an investor standpoint, someone who wants to purchase a community economy bond, a piece of the community economy bond, now they're able to hold that in their RSPs or in their TFSAs, and they can also claim that they're making an ethical investment. So hopefully people will still have money to invest once we get through this health and economic crisis. And I really want to thank you, Bashir, for the time that you took to go over this with me today.
No, it's a very insightful discussion because hopefully, if this can make people take a step back or two and think that where are we, because we're definitely not going back to the old world. That everybody agrees.
That's
where
right.
we are going, right?
So we have to start thinking out of the box and start thinking, how are we going to build a more sustainable society? So I want to thank you again.
To catch up with you, thanks very much, Jeff Moll. And like Jeff says, you can look at LinkedIn. We'll provide you emails so you can find out more and hopefully get involved. The research that
hey, and if you like what I'm talking about, go ahead and add me to your LinkedIn network. I'm always looking to build my network, and if you want to join in and be an advisor to the board, if you see a business opportunity where this could be applied and you want to talk to me about it, by all means, I'm more than happy to have that conversation.
Fantastic. Thanks very much, Jeff. I really appreciate that. And we will talk soon. All the very best.